the law enforcement agencies in the United States took a great interest into figuring out, where did that money go and how was it laundered.
Yeah, fascinating. I'm just trying to picture you going from being a sort of mild-mannered Oxford student to like tracking hitmen across the globe. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Crypto Playbook, Episode 3, Crypto Crime. I'm Jeff John Roberts, finance editor of Fortune magazine.
And I'm Leo Schwartz, reporter covering crypto and finance at Fortune.
Well, Leo, the first couple of episodes we talked about, Bitcoin and the broader world of crypto, and now we're going into this episode is called Crypto Crime, and I think even people who know nothing about crypto probably know there's a lot of crime involved.
Yeah, and I think we can have a disclaimer at the front of this to get the crypto people off our back. Of course, crime happens in other types of finance. Every single major bank has probably been charged with some violation of money laundering or has been subject to scammers taking money off of their users. But what happens in crypto is a completely different type of animal.
Yeah, I think, and I'm just going to follow up Leo's disclaimer saying, I'll put it out there, I like crypto and I believe in crypto and I think it's a great technology. And as Leo said, not only is there crime at banks and traditional finance things, Bitcoin's been used for a lot of crime, but so too has been gold. And the most popular, currency for crime, of course, is American $100 bills or $20 bills. So that's out of the way. But let's go back to why is crypto so notorious?
Well, initially it was because you don't need any sort of identity check to be able to theoretically access Bitcoin or send Bitcoin. This was at least the early idea that it could be this completely anonymous or at least pseudonymous form of payment, where as long as you had access to a computer, you could have access to this form of currency and be able to send it. And you saw the rise early on in crypto of use cases like Silk Road, this dark web marketplace where you could buy drugs or arms or theoretically hitmen and pay for it with cryptocurrency in a way that law enforcement wouldn't be able to check, where, for example, you were using your credit card to pay for acid.
Yeah, because you touch a traditional financial system, the government is all over that. They know where you're spending your money. They can, grab your bank account. There's a ton of records. But early Bitcoin, especially, it was a libertarian's dream, and I think being used by people who sincerely believe in it, that we have a right to privacy. And I think that is a good ideal, especially as, surveillance becomes more pervasive. But it appealed a lot to true libertarians, but also who really like this were criminals. Because as you're saying, Leo, it's, an anonymous way to pay people. It's like dropping bags of cash for someone, but you can drop that bag of cash with, just the click of a button all over the world.
And so you have this category of crypto being used as a way to facilitate crime. And then just because it still is a fairly underdeveloped technology, at least in comparison to traditional finance, so you had a lot of criminals basically realizing there was this huge honeypot of being able to go to these very poorly developed exchanges and seize huge amounts or hack huge amounts of crypto. So I think early on, big crypto stories besides Bitcoin is being used by college students to buy drugs, was these massive hacks that happened on early exchanges like Mt. Gox, where people would lose all of their money because cyber criminals realized they could really easily steal it.
Yeah, and here's where I do have to stick up for crypto, and especially for Bitcoin, in that I think casual observers will assume there's something insecure about Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a computer program and a network, and it is bulletproof. Bitcoin has never been hacked. And by that I mean being able to somehow compromise the code to go in and have the Bitcoin network go and send money to to Leo or to someone else out there rather than to who it's intended.
So the other biggest misunderstood aspect of crypto, and I think you're going to touch on this with Jonathan Levin, our guest for this episode, is this idea that Bitcoin is anonymous, and I think that was pretty quickly destroyed by firms like Chainalysis, Jonathan Levin's company, that emerged and basically said potentially crypto is even more traceable than a lot of fiat payments because it's actually happening out in the public. Anybody can view it through transactions that are recorded on blockchain with these string of letters and numbers, which are your addresses. And once you can actually connect someone to that address, you can see this whole ecosystem in which payments are happening. And that really got away this allure, this early allure of crypto, that it was a fully anonymous form of payment.
Yeah, I mean, it's the most transparent system there is. Every transaction is on a public blockchain. You can go to, so-called, Blockchain Explorer and go look at it for yourself. And if I send Leo, a bit of Bitcoin, it'll be there too. I mean, of course, you have to identify the wallet who is in the first place. And typically when someone is hacked, the person who got robbed will like, here's my wallet, and you'll see where it moved. And there's ways to do sort of forensic analysis to figure out who likely holds the other wallet, where it is or what, have some general clues about it. And yeah, that's who we're going to talk with, a fellow named Jonathan Levin, who I've known for years. Very smart guy, very nice guy, and he's built a very impressive business catering to, guess who, to law enforcement.
Yeah, I think a really interesting aspect of crypto has been this continued narrative of almost cops and robbers, but the cops and robbers are both within crypto, where you've had a lot of cyber criminals who realize the profitability of operating in crypto, but you also have a bunch of these firms like Chainalysis, like TRM Labs, like Elliptic that have emerged, a lot of them from crypto developers themselves who have realized the wealth of information that you can get from these blockchains. And of course, a lot of former law enforcement officials, many of whom worked on these early cases looking at criminality happening within crypto and then moved to these firms who were building new technology around tracing what was happening within blockchains.
Yeah, and I mean, to be clear, there still is a lot of crime going on with crypto, because also too, it's just global. You can move it around easily, and so, some of the biggest hackers are the North Korean military, who are very good at stealing it. And then Russian criminal gangs. These are very smart, sophisticated people who are good at taking it.
Yeah, and I think just one of the most interesting questions around crypto crime and these companies like Chainalysis is that, of course, on one hand, you have crypto as this libertarian dream. It's a way to be able to send money anonymously, but you also have people in crypto crime arguing that this is a better way to actually trace criminal behavior than actual fiat currency because of the public nature. And I think there's this natural tension between people trying to convince regulators, hey, this is actually a good thing for you, versus people saying, no, this is the only way we can preserve privacy.
Yeah, very true. And also, I think the competence of law enforcement's gotten so much better. I mean, I don't know what to make of President Trump disbanding the crypto enforcement unit, because those are people, you need some special skills to be able to trace this stuff.
Yeah, well, excited to hear from Jonathan about what's happening in the world of crypto crime.
Look forward to it.
Welcome, Jonathan. Great to see you again. Thanks for coming on the Crypto Playbook.
Great to be here. Nice to see you, Jeff.
Good. Your beard is longer. Is that part of you became CEO, what, six months ago? And did you decide to stop shaving at that point?
Yeah, it comes with the territory. In fact, we hope that the beard grows with the revenue. That's the philosophy.
I like it. Yeah. So as long as the revenue's growing, don't cut it. For our listeners, Jonathan, to sum up your job, you've co-founded a company that helps entities like the FBI and Interpol track down bad guys across the world. So I guess my first question is, what did you do before that?
It's a great sort of question, and it's not the obvious answer. So I didn't do anything with law enforcement before we started Chainalysis. In fact, I would say in my British way that I'd never spoken to a cop before I actually started Chainalysis. So I got into crypto pretty early in 2012. I was an academic economist at the University of Oxford, and I was looking for something interesting to write about, and I came across Bitcoin at the pub, and my friend Tom at the time sort of introduced me over a few beers to the concept of Bitcoin and arbitrage trading, and I told him that this was something that was ludicrous, that would never work, and I needed to understand it a little bit more. And I ended up writing some of the earliest game theory into how Bitcoin actually secures itself from an economic point of view. And during that research, I really figured out that there needed to be someone that understands really how and why people use cryptocurrency, and have sort of spent the last 12 years, 13 years really building the answer to that question of how and why do people use cryptocurrencies.
When you're starting out, though, I mean, tell me about like who was your first client. One tricky thing about interviewing Jonathan is he's not only smart, he's discreet. If he goes blabbing about all the sensitive stuff he does, he won't get clients. So he can be a bit cagey at times, but we understand that. But who was your like very first law enforcement client? You have to identify them, just say what country they're from or what they were like and how you got the contract.
Yeah, I would say that we have spoken about this a little bit, but maybe I'll spill a little bit more than I would usually spill on these topics. And I was actually a law enforcement agency in the United States that deals with alcohol, tobacco, and firearms and explosives. There's actually multiple agencies that could be, but there's one in particular that it may refer to. And we were working across the Atlantic and flying over here to educate people that it was really possible to track and trace cryptocurrencies. And I think that we invented the field and demonstrated to those law enforcement agencies at the time that it was actually possible to track and trace Bitcoin, and it was possible to build these investigations. And in the early days of conducting business with the government, people would come with all sorts of novel techniques to be able to procure software. So maybe we were on the expense credit card in the beginning before people were really putting through the real federal acquisitions rules and regulations that actually do exist. And so people were showing us very early on that there was insane demand for the product that we had invented, which is called Reactor, and really, people went to great lengths to get it in their hands as soon as possible because they had active investigations that they couldn't do without it.
Yeah. And if you can just, is it possible for you to tell us a little more about that specific first case that may or may not have involved the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms? Can you say what the crime was? I mean, presumably this was years and years ago. So.
Yeah, so there were a few different cases that they worked on and that others worked on. At the time, there were a couple of markets that were opening up on the dark web that were surrounded around taking hits on people, and so there were actually different darknet markets that had people that were offering Hitmen as a service online, and obviously that was of great interest to lots of different law enforcement agencies. And so some of those early cases were really around that integral issue of public safety. And so those were some of the initial cases. And then the other case that we were sort of involved in very early on, and I would say we sort of dog fooded our own solutions for, was the Mt. Gox investigation, which where we really helped the creditors of Mt. Gox, which was the largest cryptocurrency exchange in the world at the time that went bankrupt. We helped them figure out where the money had gone, and when we figured out that the money had actually been stolen from the exchange, obviously the law enforcement agencies in the United States took a great interest into figuring out where did that money go and how was it laundered.
Yeah, fascinating. I'm just trying to picture you going from being a sort of mild-mannered Oxford student to like tracking hitmen across the globe, which is pretty cool. But sticking with the technical stuff for a second, I mean, for newer listeners or people new to crypto, the Bitcoin blockchain, of course, is immutable and every transaction is recorded. And you can view it through software called Blockchain Explorer, which shows it all. But if you don't know what you're looking at, it's really hard to make sense of. So am I right, Jonathan? In the early days, Chainalysis was simply about coming out with better interfaces that could show how the money hopped around, or what's the product like? What exactly are you buying when you go to Chainalysis?
Yeah, so actually, we did more than that from the beginning. I think that to literally knock someone off a chair, which happened to me in our early meetings, where people would slam their hands on the table and say like, "This is the best thing I've seen since sliced bread." We had to do more than that, and so what we ended up doing was we built a database of what transactions which services had placed inside the blockchain. So if you think about the Bitcoin blockchain or any blockchain today, typically there is a service that someone is using to actually put that transaction in the blockchain, whether that is Coinbase or whether that is Kraken or whether that is Bank of New York Mellon today. Everyone is using some form of service to be able to put those transactions into the blockchain. And so that was really the critical link that law enforcement needed to go from being able to just see the transaction on the blockchain or in a block explorer to really the context behind where they could get more information for their investigation. And it turns out that doing that task of, having the comprehensive set of which services put which transactions in the blockchain is actually pretty difficult. You need to be able to do two things. You need to be able to get ground truth data of some of the transactions that those services have done. And you need to be able to run what we call clustering algorithms on the blockchain itself in order to be able to take that one label of a transaction that was done by Kraken and label the entire Kraken presence on the Bitcoin blockchain or the Ethereum blockchain or something like that. So really, that's what we did. Was we built this big database of all of the services that were online at the time. We actually made transactions with a lot of those services, and then we actually ran clustering algorithms on all of the different wallets that exist in order to be able to give everyone like a full set of these transactions were done by this service, these other transactions were done by another service. And that's really what got people sort of excited about Chainalysis, was the data that we actually had that was unique to us and would help them in their investigations.
Yeah. I remember in your early days, Chainalysis explored a few different business models as startups do. And for a while, you were trying to, perhaps sell also to hedge funds to trade on, but then you went all in and decided, who your company is as a service for law enforcement. Today, how many customers do you have in how many countries approximately?
Yeah, so we're active in almost 100 countries around the world today. We have, teams on the ground in over 30 countries around the world where we go and deploy our resources to make sure that we're serving those local markets with local needs. And we work with, over 330 government agencies in those markets. And, we have well over 1,000 customers at this point, to on the private sector side, on helping them comply with regulation, prevent fraud, and secure their applications. And so really our business has gone from, in the very early days of being quite government focused on performing these investigations to today, very sort of even between, working with the industry and working with government agencies around the world.
I want to go back to the crime because this episode of the Crypto Playbook is about crime. And what I'm curious about is in the early days, Bitcoin, a lot of people assumed it was anonymous. Not so much. It's actually Bitcoin's not very good for crime in some ways. But even early on, there was so-called privacy coins, Monero, Zcash, stuff like that. So I'd like to know, just focusing on the coins the criminals are using, take us to today. Which currencies are being used by cyber criminals?
Really, I mean, I would say that there is still a majority of criminals using Bitcoin, to a large extent on marketplaces or transactions between each other. There's still heavy use of cryptocurrencies. But if you actually look at sort of crime in general follows usage patterns of the underlying technology. And so if you look at the amount of transactions on chain today, more than 50% of all transactions, actually closer to 80% of all transactions, are conducted in stable coins. And so if you think about where crime moves with all of the different payment activity that's on there. And so you definitely see, again, where the usage of criminal activity is on paying for something or doing something in a normal currency. You can see that starting to manifest in different stable coins. And I think that's just natural as the pace of adoption of stable coins increases. And the question behind your sort of question is what about the use of anonymizing technology, and does that not pose some sort of existential risk, or is that like very popular? And actually what we find is that yes, there are anonymizing techniques that are being used by particularly the organized crime and larger nation state level actors. But always there is vulnerabilities that we can find where you may need to jump from one blockchain to the next, which you can in Chainalysis products. You may need to look at timing of different payments to determine the flow of funds. You may need to use multiple different tools, but ultimately I think that it's possible to continue to trace criminal activity, and none of the anonymizing currencies or technologies that exist have fundamentally broken the pattern of analysis that we can do at Chainalysis with our customers.
I guess looking into the future, Jonathan, I think you're right. It's sort of a cat and mouse game that always evolves. If you're sort of law enforcement right now, what should you be looking at in the coming year or two? What's kind of the new threat or peril or action on the crypto front?
I think that the law enforcement agencies that we work with have a really interesting challenge in front of them. And that challenge is actually to think about how do we take a much more proactive stance against some of the criminal activity that is happening in our networks. We've seen scams increase a lot across the world where innocent people are losing money to cryptocurrency scams, or even scams more broadly outside of pure cryptocurrency and be laundered through cryptocurrency. How do they take a more sort of strategic network level disruption view against these actors? And how also do they equip really the men and women who are like right at the frontier of law enforcement with some basic skills and actually tools to be able to understand cryptocurrency in their context, in their operation? And so the thing that we have been focused on at Chainalysis is making sure that we've got the ability to have both macro level tools on threats that sit strategically in offices that are going after fentanyl trafficking across the world that needs to be disrupted at a network level, or organized crime groups that are targeting individuals in countries, and scammers that are targeting vulnerable people in society, or networks where people are being paid to kidnap people. These things need to be tackled at a strategic, proactive, intelligence-led operation. And that's something that we're very focused on enabling across our law enforcement customers around the world, as well as the people who are going around the streets. As cryptocurrency becomes a lot more prevalent in people's daily lives, it gets involved in the petty crime, the street crime, the local mobile phones that are being stolen off the streets of London and need to be recovered. Those aspects require a law enforcement agent that's in the street actually having good tools at their fingertip to actually be able to identify cryptocurrency and exploit that as they need to in their investigations. And the good news is that I wouldn't say that AI saves the day, but AI is definitely making that barrier to entry a lot easier for the people that are new to crypto, especially inside the Chainalysis product portfolio.
Yeah, that makes sense, because in the early days, there's just a handful of people who knew what crypto was, let alone how to use it, and some very impressive early IRS agents and people like that. But I know it was a very exclusive skill set, so it's good to hear it's going down to the more street level. I should have asked this earlier too, but in terms of like actually catching it, like these investigations, sometimes they do result in seizures, right? My understanding is if like criminals are sloppy, or they place it in a Western jurisdiction, it can sometimes be seized by working with an exchange or something. But a lot of the time, it's very sophisticated people in North Korea or Russia who grab it and move it overseas. And, all you can really do is you can identify, they did it, but you're not going to get it back. Is that a fair summary?
There's actually a little bit of a shift happening. And actually, this is something that stablecoins uniquely offer. And something that people should understand is that actually the stablecoins are an avenue to actually not necessarily recover the money, but definitely freeze assets from being used again. And so actually what we've seen is that even if you are hiding in another jurisdiction that is outside of the reach of Western democracies or something like that, you'll see that actually a freeze order has been able to be given to the likes of Tether and Circle, and those stablecoin issuers are actually able to freeze those assets from moving further. And so maybe you can't recover those criminal proceeds, but you can definitely inflict a pain on the people who stole the money in the first place, or some sort of criminal enterprise from benefiting from their activities. And so I would say that exchanges around the world are able to seize money and return money to victims. And as Chainalysis, we've helped the US government seize over $11 billion of criminal proceeds that some of which will go back to victims, and some of which will maybe go into a Bitcoin stockpile at some point. But really, like that is actually possible with this technology. But there's also the potential to just freeze money, which can cause a lot of pain to those illicit actors.
Well, sounds like a lot of work, and I hope you're still finding time to have some fun as CEO. And are you still able to get on your mountain bike this year?
I've been riding. I have been. I went riding wherever I go. I usually take a bicycle with me, and so managed to sneak in some rides in Spain recently, and France on some travels. And you won't catch me in the Tour de France race, but you may catch me alongside it.
Okay, well, as long as you're finding some time to play. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan Levin, another crypto OG. We're very lucky to have on the Crypto Playbook from Fortune. Thanks so much, Jonathan.
Thanks, Jeff.
Maybe one of the most fashionable people in crypto, other than the ones who wear their pudgy penguin shirts. But
yeah, and also I'll give him one of the most normal people in crypto too, which is a huge plus for me. The other element that struck me too in listening to it was it feels a little bit like a new science. Like there's a couple books about when fingerprinting technology first came out. People wrote whole novels on that. Mark Twain did, on this new sort of form of detective work through fingerprints. And for me, blockchain is kind of the same way. And I just think it's really neat how this industry is sprung up around it. The crime, but also the crime stoppers. But also I think there's room for reality check. I think Jonathan is out there selling crypto crime solutions, and it's sometimes you get the impression like, my goodness, everything can be tracked now. It's all going to be fine. What's your take? Do you think are you reassured that there's blockwork forensics things out there to stop the rampant crime, or do you think the criminals are still 5 steps ahead?
Well, it's funny. I've always thought there's a tension in crypto where you have the advocates saying this is safer than traditional finance. We're going to stop all the crime that's there. And then obviously the companies like Chainalysis that needs crime to exist in order to make money and has to convince the government that they'll always have a need for them to be there. And then also at the same time, people who say crypto is great for being more pseudonymous and more private. And then companies like Chainalysis saying, actually, we can track everything. That's why it's better than fiat. So it's a funny dichotomy, I think, in crypto, but they do all seem to get along and sometimes work for the same common goal.
Yeah. Are you saying there's contradictions in the crypto industry? You're kidding. Yeah. No, but I think, to be fair, that's the case, traditional finance, banks are safe, put your money here, but banks are forever, getting robbed and going under. And, in case of Wells Fargo, stealing from their own customers. So, I think crypto as it grows up is entitled to some of the same contradictions. But thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll be back next week, and we're going to take a closer look at investing in crypto. This was the Crypto Playbook, a podcast by Fortune Magazine.
This episode was produced by Jaylon Ursoy and edited by Ellen Estev. Art direction by Ariel Ray. Fortune's executive producer is Lydia Randall. Head of video is Adam Bannicky.
Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.